Dear all, greetings from Hong Kong. My name is Patrick Dransfield of the in-house community, and it is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the US and UK friendly Women in Law webinar on the topic, is COVID-19 taking women's lawyers' careers back to the 1950s? The webinar is moderated by Sally Dyson of Firm Sense and starts with a 15-minute presentation from Christina Blacklaws, former president of the Law Society of England and Wales. Both are in London. A big thank you to our supporters who have made it possible for this to be a free-to-attend webinar. They are the international section of the American Bar Association, Firm Sense Cool in a Crisis, Beijing International Arbitration Commission, David's Polk, dazychain, eBay, Gibson, Dunn, Hammad and Al-Mehdar law firm, Investcorp, K&L Gates, Kirkland and Ellis, L&T and Partners, Major Lindsey in Africa, Meyer, Unkovic, Scott, National Conference of Women's Bar Association, Priat, Janinto and Santos, SSEK Indonesia, AsiaLaw Portal, Levick, and the Center for Inclusive Leadership. Sally and Christina will be joined by a fantastic panel, which includes Patricia Lee Rifo, the newly sworn-in president of the American Bar Association. Congratulations, Trish. The full panel is Sally Dyson, consultant and coach to the legal profession at Firm Sense and Cool in a Crisis. Christina Blacklaws, consultant and former president of the Law Society of England and Wales. Barbara Becker, partner and chair of the firm-wide diversity committee, Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher, based in New York. Kate Brewer, partner, Denton's Global Client Development and Denton's Canada, based in Toronto. Linda Meyers, senior partner and founder of Women's Leadership Initiative, Kirkland and Ellis, based in Chicago. Palava Mahi, co-United States and Seattle managing partner, chair of firm-wide diversity committee at K&L Gates, and she's based in Seattle. Patricia Lee Refo, or actually Trish Refo, president of the American Bar Association and partner of Snell and Wilner's Phoenix, Arizona office. Paul Anderson Walsh, co-founder of the Center for Inclusive Leadership, who's based in London, and Sonia Wiseman, partner Reed Smith, based in New York. The discussion will last for about 70 minutes, and it will be proving both stimulating and illuminating. If you'd like to ask questions during the webinar, please make full use of the chat box function in the usual manner, and Sally will address your questions either during the discussion or we'll do our best to answer all the questions at the end. We have approximately 180 registrations on the call today, and 15% of them are men. A very quick word about the in-house community. We were founded in 1998, and its mission, our mission, is to empower and educate in-house counsel for the benefit of all. We have over 20,000 members altogether, from Tokyo to the United States, and in the pre-COVID days, we would host 17 in-house congresses annually. Over 2,400 in-house counsel across Asia, the Middle East, and South Africa attended at least one of our in-house congresses in 2019. And this is a percentage of women attendees of our in-house community. We had around about 2,400 delegates altogether, 60% of which were female. And as you can see, around about 51% of those of our GCs were also women. That's a little bit less than the full percentage perhaps, but this is a good deal better than the percentage of general counsel being women in the UK, for instance. However, there is no room for complacency, for as the in-house career for lawyers in emerging markets is relatively new. Not quite so in North America, but in our emerging markets, it's relatively new. In the 1950s, during the early days of technology in North America, over 30% of engineers were women, a statistic that is well beyond that particular profession in Silicon Valley now. During Christina's and also Sally's presentation, you'll be provided with useful data to help frame our discussion. And one institution you may well hear quoted is a UK-based Institute of Fiscal Studies. Their work indicates that COVID-19, the pandemic, has indeed affected women's careers adversely. but at least in the UK, we can collect data. To quote Cathy O'Neill, author of Weapons of Math Destruction, data is not really neutral. In fact, it is the opposite of neutral. Sad to say, in the United States, during the first year of the Trump administration, House Republicans passed a bill that actually stopped the use of federal money to measure both gender and racial pay gaps. Now, I'm going to actually quote an interesting article from the FT's Philip Stevens called "The Path from COVID to a New Social Contract." Stevens uses a metaphor of the 4 ripples coming from a drop of water to illustrate the impact of the COVID pandemic over time. And you can see the first impact. I think we've all been familiar with that. Indirect health results and missed cancer, unintended consequences are the second impact. Social and economic impact, rising governance and economic impact is the third. And curiously enough, choices for the future, nationalist roots or forging a better and shared future. Now, in my final comments, I'm going to focus on this 4th circle. And we do need to act now relating to this 4th stage of the pandemic, as we are at what anthropologists describe as the liminal stage or the liminal moment. A liminal moment is one in which participants in an event or trauma, and in this pandemic, we are all participants, stand at a threshold between the previous way of structuring our identity, time, and community, and a new way. 2 macroeconomic examples come to mind: the resulting choices to the global situation following the First World War and the choices made after the Second World War. The choices made after the First World War veered to protectionism and nationalism encapsulated in the grossly unfair Treaty of Versailles, which actually ultimately led to the Second World War. The choices made by the international community of nations following the end of the Second World War, and we can believe that to some degree we may have learnt our lesson, led to the founding of international institutions such as the World Bank, the International Bar Association, the World Trade Organization, and the IMF. But significant as they continue to be, all the above relate to economic or legal change and not social change. Social change, especially for women, actually went backwards during the 1950s. As we will discover, COVID-19 has brought much suffering, but has also pressed the reset button. We could go either backwards or forwards. For the legal profession in all its guises, leaders prepared to listen, to offer competence, fairness, and empathy have an audience. It is an opportunity that many of us, all human beings, can afford not to waste. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Patrick, for that really powerful introduction to our webinar today. And thank you to everyone who has joined us today. We've been quite overwhelmed with the level of response that we've received to our webinar, and we were never actually in any doubt that this was an important topic, but your enthusiastic sign up for the webinar has really shown us how this subject just resonates around the globe. I've got a question for Patrick. Patrick, I'd really like to understand, and I expect our audience is curious as well, what makes this topic so important to you, this topic of women lawyers' careers?
Well, thank you, Sally. 3 things come immediately to mind. Firstly, having worked as a non-partner in 2 international law firms, I can attest at first hand to the very male, feudalistic, and caste-like mindset of at least some of the partners, not all of the partners, but some of them, whether unconsciously or consciously. Secondly, I heard at second hand how the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 brought about what one disgusted senior partner in a magic circle firm described as a bloodbath of redundancies, which bore no relation to the evaluation policies and the culture of gender equality and diversity that the firm actually professed. So I really don't want us to go back that way. And thirdly, my mother's own career. My mother, Pauline Drake, graduated, joined the workforce, and then became a mother during the 1950s. A decade before, women in Britain, including my mum's mum, had become a vital workforce during the Second World War. However, from the 50s to the early 1970s, the old patriarchy had been firmly re-established. So much so that under the socialist Wilson government in the early 70s, my father was punitively taxed as a consequence of having a wife who had the audacity to work. That struck me as unfair in the 70s when I was 8, and it strikes me that if we go backwards now, that will also be criminally unfair.
Well, thank you, Patrick, for explaining that. Your long-held and sincere interest in this subject must be clear to all. To talk for a moment about my personal motivation in wanting to do this webinar, it was born both from my own experience as a working mother, but also from my experience over the past months. Whenever I've been speaking to another senior professional woman on a call or a video call, no matter what our official agenda has been, whenever I've started that call, the person I'm speaking to has needed to talk first about their struggle with juggling, homeschooling, housework, and their professional lives. Men on calls mentioned that we might be interrupted by a child wandering in, but they seemed able to leave it there. Whereas for the women I was speaking to, by contrast, the increased pressures that were caused by having children at home were clearly dominant themes for them. It's not just anecdote, though. There have been many formal academic studies that have reinforced this message. To give an example, the First 100 Years project, which was established actually to celebrate the first 100 years of women in the UK being allowed to practice as lawyers, have conducted some research on this point. And they found really quite dispiritingly that 9 out of 10 women took on more childcare responsibilities during lockdown, which perhaps in itself is not so surprising. But as a result, a third of them were forced to reduce their working hours. Half the women who were surveyed reported that they felt that they were taking on more of the domestic burden than their male partners. And what makes this particularly interesting, I think, for today's audience, and particularly relevant for professionals such as lawyers, is that the same research found that actually the unequal burden of domestic responsibilities was actually falling more highly on women in high-income households, including households where both adults in the household were high-earning professionals. And yet in those cases, the women were taking on a bigger domestic load, and so their ability to work was being impacted even more. Patrick said that I'd mentioned the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and they've conducted quite a lot of research in this area as well. And they found that women in the UK certainly had on average only been able to perform about a third as much work as men had been able to during the lockdown. And also, I think rather shockingly, they found that working mothers were 47% more likely than working fathers to have lost their jobs or felt that they had to resign during COVID. So statistics like the ones I've just quoted, they clearly show that women's equality and careers are at severe risk of setback at this time. But I also feel really convinced that this doesn't have to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Patrick has talked about the extraordinary times that we find ourselves in, and it makes us question how we live our lives, how we conduct our business, our ambitions for our livelihoods and our lifestyles. And whilst we clearly face significant threats at the moment, we're also on the cusp of opportunity. So in hosting this webinar, we are really hoping to shine a light on the realities for women who are working, women in the legal profession, but crucially also to discuss solutions and opportunities as perceived by our panelists. We've really got a stellar panel assembled today, and we're so grateful to them for giving their time today to talk about this topic of whether COVID-19 is taking women's careers back to the 1950s. And shortly, it will be my pleasure to invite each panelist to come and share their perspectives, their experience, and their advice, and also to answer questions from you, the audience. But first, to set the scene, I'm going to invite Christina Blacklaws to speak. Christina, as you've heard, is now a consultant at Black Laws Consulting, and she's also the immediate past president, hello Christina, the immediate past president of the Law Society of England and Wales. While she was there, she led a terrifically important global research project on women in the law, and that project has resulted in a suite of recommendations, both for women, but one thing that I particularly like, also for male champions of change as well. So I'm now going to invite Christina to explain to us the key lessons from her research. Welcome, Christina.
Hello, Sally, and it's a delight to be here. Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in. Now, I am the immediate past president of the Law Society of England and Wales, but actually gender equality and women in leadership in law has been something which has been a passion of mine throughout my life. Being an office holder in the Law Society gave me a real opportunity to be able to do something about that. So I was really fortunate to be able to spearhead a significant piece of research, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. I'm just conscious though that I can't see, and I'm not sure you can see my my screen, my PowerPoint.
Christina, I can see your PowerPoint and I can see you very well.
Excellent. I can't see it and therefore I can't move it. I'm going to try. Okay. I'm just going to, sorry about this, guys. I'm just going to, there we are, that's better. I can't see me now. I can see my PowerPoint much better. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
I can see your PowerPoint and I can hear you very well.
Okay, well, let's just go with the PowerPoint then, guys. Okay, so really for me, the most important thing was to evidence that gender equality is good for everyone. It's not just an issue for 50% of us, it's an issue for 100% of us. And it works as well for men as well as women. It enables those with protected characteristics and lets us all be liberated from our stereotypes so that we can thrive in a diverse and a supportive environment, which, guess what, is great for our mental health. And if that hasn't convinced everybody, then of course we can make out a really hard-nosed business case. Gender equality equates with profitability. There's so much to be gained. It's a real shock in some ways that we're still having to talk about it. But hey, we know that we're by no means near there yet. So in the UK, and I know this is the same for the United States and Canada, we don't have a problem with getting women into law. That's not the issue for us. For the last 30 years, women have represented about 2/3 of the new entrants into the legal profession in the UK. So the vast majority of the pipeline is female, and over 50%, about 52% of practicing lawyers are now women as well. But when we get to leadership levels, and we focused on private practice because that was really where the most significant problem is. All we could get to, the biggest number we could get to was 31% of women who are partners. And that belies the fact that in some of our largest global law firms, you'll struggle to find 15% female ownership. So even though considerable strides have been made, we found systemic bias, and it's completely unacceptable that in 2020 people are still being held back from fulfilling their potential because of their gender, their race, or any other protected characteristic. So we decided to try and investigate why, and we undertook the largest ever global survey involving over 8,000 people. And this is what we asked the survey, what we asked people to advise us on was, what was the main barrier, the main reason why women were not getting to positions of authority and power in there we are, in law firms. And this is what they told us. So the biggest reason, and in North America, you probably call this implicit bias, but the majority of people said it's about implicit or unconscious bias. And I would add to that actual, genuine, straight up bias as well. But that was seen as the major barrier. And 49% of people recognised that there's an unacceptable work-life balance demanded to reach senior levels, and that was a major concern. 46% that the law is effectively male-shaped, so that traditional networks and routes to promotion are really quite male-orientated. And 60% were aware of a gender or an equal pay gap in their organisation. So, and remember, this is global research. So we use these insights to inform our roundtables, and in the last couple of years we completed 250 roundtables in 19 countries involving about 8,000, again, men and women in the profession. And these are some of the pictures of the roundtables that we had. I was really fortunate to facilitate 48 in 18 countries, and that's where we had them. And we created specific toolkits, one for the men and one for the women, to focus us on the primary issues and solutions, but also to encourage everyone to become activists for gender equality in their organisations and their communities. And from the research, we grouped our findings into 3 separate reports, one for the domestic female roundtables, one for the men's roundtables, and one for all the international roundtables. And I'm just going to run through some of the things that we found from there thematically. So from the women's domestic roundtables was a real concern about not fitting that traditional image of a business leader, and how that archetypal ideal of what it takes to lead favours characteristics that are really traditionally male, whilst female traits were often undervalued or seen negatively. A lack of representation. There's a strong desire amongst women to see people who are like them, people to whom they can relate at positions of leadership. And this was felt really strongly by junior women who wanted to see and feel that they had senior leadership potential. The impact of assumptions that has on ambitions. So how being presumed to be the tea girl, the note taker, assistant to a much more junior male colleague can be corrosive, demoralising, and undermining of our confidence. Assumptions of inferiority can have devastating impacts on our career. And perhaps most significantly, that intersectionality lands a very heavy blow for women with more than one protected characteristic. Time and again, women told us about the many additional barriers they face. And quite frankly, unless women from diverse backgrounds are promoted to the top tier, it signals that they're just not wanted there. From the men's roundtables, the men recognised that women were significantly underrepresented in senior positions, and that this had led to a very large, in the UK, gender pay gap. And there was a real focus on the female talent pipeline, the need to really ensure that women are promoted and that they are engaged in terms of succession planning. So going further down that female talent pipeline to make sure that women at early stages of their careers had the same opportunities, the same experiences, the same ability to build their careers as men. And finally, from the international roundtables, as I say, I had an opportunity to be involved in a lot of these, and I went in with my own assumption that women's experiences would be very different across the world. But whereas some accounts were quite eye-watering, our research evidence that the challenges and the experiences of female lawyers are very similar across the globe. These are shared experiences in relation to traditional gender roles and stereotypes, gender pay disparity, and the lack of flexible working. Around the world, there are cultural and social expectations about how we should behave because of our gender. And I think this has really played out during COVID. And this was especially felt by working mothers who were penalised for their additional caregiving commitments outside of work. A serious lack of transparency about financial compensation everywhere really it negatively impacts women. The identification of pay discrepancies undermines or prevents accountability for ensuring that compensation is fair and equal. Now, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes, because I've probably depressed you enough now, just talking about some of the solutions. So from our survey, these were the main solutions identified. So access to and mainstreaming of flexible working. Well, we've had that as a working pilot now across the globe, haven't we, for many months. And I'm sure we'll come back to this. Mentoring and sponsorship, including reverse mentoring, promoting and celebrating and making visible leaders, female and male, who are perhaps role modeling family-friendly behaviours. And crucially, engaging men in the equality debate. We need male champions to be responsible, to see themselves as accountable for bringing about gender equality in their firms and businesses. And again, thematically from the reports, leadership is absolutely key. We need our leaders to lead from the top by example, walking the talk and ensuring that diversity and inclusion is absolutely the heart of all business planning. It's as a priority the same way as operational risk, finance and compliance monitoring. Encouraging much greater transparency and providing great training. We all carry around our own set of biases. And quite frankly, we're a bit dangerous if we're making decisions about others without awareness of that. And most importantly, I guess, getting the policies right and embedding those policies. Too often we focus on fixing the women when actually we really need to fix the systems, and that is incredibly important. So what did we do with all of this? We produced a blueprint for gender balance, and that really is the distillation of everything we learned, divided up into how to do it for small law firms, large law firms, and for the in-house community. And we also got the support of all the representative bodies in the UK and the UK government for a Women in Law pledge. And this pledge, or the people who sign up to it, commit to work to address gender inequality by tackling discrimination, bullying and harassment in the workplace, challenging any equal pay or gender pay issues, and appointing senior and accountable champions, and ensuring that they address workplace cultures and bias, and publishing targets and action plans. It's all about accountability. So I will probably end with that and come back onto the screen so that you can see me again, I hope. There we are.
Perfect, Christina, well done. Thank you so much, and thank you for those really rich and global insights with practical solutions. Now, of course, you developed all this material before COVID, but
Yes.
It still seems all those issues, they haven't gone away, highly relevant. In a nutshell, in your view, what are the biggest challenges and opportunities arising from COVID for gender equality?
Gosh, that's a massive question. I think what COVID has done is it's intensified the problems that we had before. So the real challenges here and now are around the fact that in the UK, the stats say that women do 2/3 of the childcare. And I expect probably at least the same amount of elder care and double the amount of housework, cooking, cleaning, etc., that men do. And this has really been brought into focus over COVID, where professional women who may have had a lot of support, got themselves really quite well lined up in terms of childcare and domestic care, that all fell away, and they were left carrying the burden and quite frankly really struggling to be able to do that and work as well. I think we're going to see a lot of burnout, unfortunately, as a result of COVID. So that's the real challenge. Where the opportunity lies, for me, I do a lot in the tech world. So I like disruption. Where there is disruption, it gives that real opportunity to ensure that those who have been disadvantaged by the status quo can shift the dial, and that's really where we need to focus, I think. So the things that are going to make a massive difference post-COVID is a normalization of flexible and agile working. The business is to find a way to support working mothers through the early and intense stages of child rearing. That is going to make a huge difference. But I also think that we have now the opportunity, because we are living in a much more virtual world, to change the dynamic when it comes to things like business development and making relationships. So from barroom and sports to something that actually is much more inclusive, generally speaking, of women and people with other protected characteristics. So I'm really, on balance, I'm really hopeful that we can build back better now.
Thank you so much, Christina. A very hopeful note to end your piece on, although we hope to bring you back later for the questions. Thank you very much. If I could ask you now to switch off your webcam and your mic, we're going to go quickly to an audience poll, because we think it would be good to get the measure of our audience and to understand your situations. And so if I could ask Raoul to pull up our first poll, please. We'll do this very quickly. Just want to get a snapshot of your personal view as audience members of the impact of COVID on gender equality within your own organisations. Has it suffered? Has there been no change? Or has it even improved? If you quickly press the right buttons, and we'll see what the results are. And Raoul, I think that's given people enough time to enter their choices. If we could see the results coming up. Okay, and we have 52% it suffered, but 43 no change, only 5% improved. Okay, so pretty balanced there between suffered and no change. Only a few who are able to seize the opportunities. Hopefully, as we progress through this webinar, we'll be able to see some more opportunities and ways of moving the dial, but clearly people have struggled to an extent. Thank you. We'll remove the poll now, and I'm going to invite my first panelist, Kate Brewer from Denton's, to switch on her webcam and switch on her microphone. Hello, Kate. Welcome. Thank you for stepping up as the first person to answer a question. And actually, you and I were talking earlier, and I want to pose with you the question whether you think, actually, have women in law firms really got out of the 1950s at all?
Thanks, Sally, and it's great to be here, and thanks for having me. I have to say, when you asked me the question or presented the topic on this panel, as you well know, my first question was precisely that. Have women actually ever moved out of the 1950s in law firms? And just hearing Christina's comments, I think she and I might be psychically connected, or perhaps share a parent that we didn't know about. But You know, as I thought about that question and reflected on the current state of women's progress in law firms, and if we look over the past 30 years, and I appreciate the 1950s are longer than 30 years ago, and as a fabulous colleague of mine who's a wonderful male ally said when I mentioned this panel to him, he said, well, of course they've moved beyond the 1950s because we didn't let women into law firms in the 1950s. But if I look back 30 years and we look at the progress, we still see women in very small numbers in equity partnership positions, leadership positions, top 10 compensation, and so on. And you know, Christina mentioned this focus on fixing systems and not the women. When we look at that, clearly we have systemic problems. And one of the areas I focused on is, you know, what is the work that women are traditionally asked to do in law firms and the contributions that they make? And how is that recognized and rewarded? And, you know, there's a great deal of research around strong biases that we all hold around women taking on unpaid work in organizations. And, you know, it's really interesting that women and men show an equal willingness, or shall I say unwillingness, to take on unpaid work when asked. But all of us expect that women will relent in the face of those sorts of requests and take it on. So, you know, when we look at law firm structures and we look at what it is we reward and compensate for, and then we look at the distribution of work, the question, and I really just pose it as a question that sprung to my mind is, you know, are we replicating in some ways in law firms some of the dynamics that we talk about that we see in our homes that we think women hold back or have held women back? And then, you know, if we talk about fixing the systems and not the women, and with some of these ideas in mind, part of my role, or the role one of the roles I was in prior to my current role at Denton's, which is globally working in our client development function and focusing on women and their participation in client relationships. I led our inclusion and diversity efforts in Canada, and we led it under an umbrella where all dimensions of diversity were examined. And one of the things that we really did is focused on governance and education. And we really made a conscious effort to embed inclusion and diversity in what we were doing. And while it felt like a revolution when it happened, it was really an evolutionary process. And over about a 10-year period, we were able to move from a place in Denton's, Canada, where we didn't have any women on our elected board, to where we had an elected board of 50% women. And we also had a woman step into the CEO role of our Canada region. But, you know, again, to go back to what Christina was talking about, it was really that focus on governance and education that got us to be able to move to that place.
So, Kate, I think I'm hearing from you that inclusion is a vitally important topic, not just diversity. And I know we have other panelists who are going to agree violently with you, and we'll hear more on that subject from them. You've explained how we just replicate in the workplace some of the things we do in the home, but by building awareness and education at Denton's, you really were able to change things. Now, I'm very conscious that we are addressing the in-house community here, and there may be many attendees on the call who perhaps are from in-house. I myself was an in-house lawyer for a long time. I'm interested to know what you think about when we look at gender and careers in the law, what we think about in-house, whether we shouldn't just be looking through the lens of law firms. What about in-house?
In fact, I think that's a really critical point, Sally. And if we think about Patrick's figures that he shared at the beginning of the presentation, one of the things that we do know is while the in-house role may be newer in some parts of the world, women and people from other underrepresented groups have been actually leaving private practice in droves for a very, very long time, and at least for the better part of the last decade, have been moving into those in-house roles. And in many cases, I think it would be, you know, fair to say it's because they did not find a real home in private practice where they felt they could succeed. those individuals are now climbing the ladders within their organizations and taking on increasingly powerful roles, and increasingly are part of the business leadership teams. You know, I've been looking at that dynamic, and we've been thinking about that dynamic, and the real influencers in the legal community, I would say, are, you know, definitely we need to be looking at that in-house bar. As outside counsel and working in our client development team, I'm very aware of this as it affects my view on where we should focus our efforts, and because these are, quite frankly, increasingly our clients. You know, I think there's a real opportunity here for collaboration between in-house lawyers and outside counsel to drive some change and work together in the effort.
Teamwork. I'm hearing you say teamwork, and it's been my mantra as well, as someone from previously private practice, then in-house, now consulting and coaching. Getting law firms and clients to work collaboratively is the secret, isn't it? And although Patrick has some interesting statistics about the number of female general counsel in Asia, in the region that he specializes in, my experience over in the UK and Europe is that often there are more women actually in-house, and so there's an opportunity to exert buyer's power there to move the dial. Kate, I'm conscious the clock is ticking. We have a large panel. I must say thank you for now and ask you to switch off your audio and your camera while I invite Paul Anderson-Walsh to take center stage for a few minutes.
Many thanks, Sally.
Hi, Paul. Hi, Paul. Welcome. And I mentioned earlier that I was going to talk about inclusion as well as diversity. And for the benefit of our attendees, perhaps you could just say a few words about the difference between the two and why it's important not to forget inclusion.
With great pleasure. And again, thank you so much for having me on the panel. I'm delighted to be here. And I rather liked your pickup when Kate was talking about inclusion being vitally important. I thought that was a rather nice pickup because that is the point. I think we can show you in very quick time that actually inclusion is literally the kind of the elixir. It is the magic potion that will remedy practically everything we've got to deal with. And certainly if we're going to try and recover from COVID, it's going to be about that. But I think the thing that's interesting to me when I think about this direct question you're asking is that it's, I think, at the same time an easy but equally a great mistake to confuse the idea of diversity and inclusion. I think we see that a lot because what happens, certainly in my experience working with clients, is that people tend to use the words interchangeably. The reality is the words are interdependent, they're not interchangeable. And that's really quite important because diversity simply means difference. And it's helpful sometimes just to be as plain as this. If I'm talking to two, let me parody it for you, two middle-aged, middle-class white men, they are diverse. They are diverse by reason of the fact there's two of them. And it's that people don't quite understand because they think diversity means something different because what they're hearing is, right, diversity just means difference. Now, the problem with that notion of talking about difference, Sally, is people tend to hear that difference as meaning, oh, you mean other than, or you mean less than. And the problem with this conversation for us is why, unfortunately, inclusion has been caught on the barbed wire of this definition, is because we are very wedded to sameness. So simply put then, I think inclusion and its opposite, exclusion, are really and truly emotions. And it's that we have to understand. And it's how I experience you because of my difference that tells me whether I feel included or not.
Thank you for explaining that in a nutshell. And of course, today we're really focused on the role of women in law firms, but we heard from Christina earlier this concept of intersectionality. I don't know how widely that is a word that everyone is familiar with, but this idea that there are additional penalties suffered by those who have more than one minority characteristic. And so while we are focusing here today on women in the law, how do we stay mindful of the other forms of diversity, in a way trying to be inclusive of the other forms of diversity when we are focusing on helping women?
Yeah, it's a really sharp question, and it's a key question, if I may say so, because I think a lot of organisations have got off lightly on this issue. Because, and let me be candid about this, but hopefully not offensively candid about it. But I think the reality is, when we look at the statistics, and I wonder whether Christina would be able to bear this out for me. But when we look at the statistics, what we discover actually, Sally, is that gender diversity actually equates to the advancement of white women. And the reality is that black women, women of colour, have not advanced, I don't think, and benefited in any sense at the same levels when we talk about gender diversity. We have a very similar problem happen in the United Kingdom, where we have this collective expression where we refer to a group of people as BAME. And what we mean is we mean Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic. And so organisations will very proudly say to you, oh, my BAME statistics are good. Well, I was talking to one of our investment banking clients recently, and I was asking them about their diversity statistics. And they said, oh, we've got, our BAME numbers are great. I said, what are they? We've got 545 people. I said, oh, that's great. How many of them are black? And there was this rather awkward, uncomfortable silence. And then somebody rather sheepishly said, 7. And the problem is that what you're doing, I think, by using the language of just gender diversity, is you do need to understand the intersectionality, that notion, as you've rightly called out, Sally, that says actually there are more than one aspects of diversity, and it's possible that you might get through on the one, the gender, but then you're going to be blocked on the other, which in this case is race.
So Paul, thank you so much for that. And I know that as we go through the panel, we're going to try to be mindful of that as we go through as I talk to some of our panelists. So thank you very much for now, Paul. We may have a chance to come back to you again a bit later, I hope so. But for now, I'll ask you to switch off camera and mic, and I will call on Trish Rifo to join me here. Just see if it sometimes takes a second. Trish, welcome. And I particularly wanted to ask you about whether there are any special concerns that lawyers need to keep in mind about policies that on the face of it might seem to be neutral, not discriminatory in any way, but actually could have an unintended impact on women or other minorities.
Thank you, Sally. I think it's a really important question, and the American Bar Association has been working for a long time on issues around women in the legal profession, and our 2 most recent reports, Walking Out the Door, focused on more senior women in the law, and the most recent, Left Out and Left Behind, focuses on women of color. 2 really important reports. And the trick about things that look neutral but aren't is that we need to be really careful to address the unintended consequences of otherwise neutral policies. For example, as we come out of this pandemic, many law firms, many in-house places are saying, for example, come back to the office if you want to, if you feel comfortable coming back into the physical facility. Well, over time, if kids are still not in school because of the pandemic, women are not going to be able, in a neutral policy, to voluntarily come back to work in the same numbers that men are, for all the reasons that Christina was identifying earlier. So if women are largely still then at home because they're taking care of kids who aren't in school, or because they're principal caregivers to older family members, they will be left out by a otherwise neutral policy, right? The same is true with assignments of work. And this is true for in-house as well as for law firms. I'm concerned that the systems that have been built to ensure that women and other disadvantaged groups get the right work and get the professional development experience that they need will go by the wayside with neutral policies around, well, gee whiz, I'll just look around the office and see who I can find to do this project, right?
Absolutely.
When we lose our intentional systems, even with the problems they have about disadvantaging women, we also lose the systems that are designed to help women, and that's the concern.
Absolutely, such a vital point there about awareness and intention, and really thinking things through, and actually taking soundings from your female attorneys or people of color or whatever minority it is, in case there is unconscious bias in there. So that was fabulously helpful. I imagine that our audience will be really interested in those couple of papers that you mentioned there, Trish, and might not have had a chance to get it down. I suspect that afterwards Patrick might be asking you if we can add links to those papers to the hub that the in-house community have developed, so that audience members, if they'd like to access them, can do so. I hope that that will be in order.
Terrific.
Thank you so much, Trish. We are going to come back to you later, but for now, I'm going to ask you to switch off your mic and camera, and I'm going to invite Pallavi to join me. Please, Pallavi from K&L Gates. Hi, welcome.
Sally.
Welcome, Pallavi. Great to have you on board. And I know that you're a working mother and a woman of colour. I'm really interested to hear from your perspective about the balance that you're able to maintain within your practice. You've also got a senior leadership role, a management role. How do you juggle it all?
So I think, first of all, I start with the premise, which is the most important, that the most important thing in terms of my priorities is being the mother. And I'm the mother of a 6-year-old, really, really active boy who may make an appearance, may not make an appearance. And I think for me, it's about recognizing the challenge as being a real challenge, not only for me as a mother myself, but for me as a leader at my law firm. I think in the roles I have, it was interesting to hear, the prior speakers speak about how important it is for women, especially women of color. And I can speak from that perspective, to have role models and to have leadership positions and have mothers in leadership positions. So I am the US managing partner. I'm also the Seattle managing partner and the firm-wide chair of the diversity committee. And I think it's important for people to be authentic and real about these experiences and talk about being a mother. So for me, some of the strategies I maintain to kind of get through it all, you always need to remember it's his home first and my office next. And I think that's the priority in which we utilize the house. I feel like as women and mothers and leaders and practitioners, we are always making priorities. I don't believe in choices. I feel as women, we should focus on priorities, and those priorities should set our agendas for the day, as opposed to having a perspective of wanting to have to do it all on the same timeline. I think you need to be also very flexible for yourself, and that same flexibility needs to go to the team and to the whole firm, really, in how do you manage to really have, you could have a meeting at 8 o'clock at night as opposed to having it at 5 in the evening when your child is just getting into the dinner routine. You should be flexible about thinking about ways in which that same flexibility goes to all the people in your team, because it impacts everybody. I also think you should see it as an opportunity. As women, we connect. We are personal, we are connected. I think your example you gave during your presentation about how you talk to people about being a parent, how that conversation is limited or extensive depending on the gender of the other person you're talking to. It's an opportunity to connect in a way that you've not been able to engage on a personal level. So I think that's another really thing you have to think about as a professional, how you bring that to bear. And I think ending where I started, Sally, as a leader, you need to make sure that what you're doing to cope as a mother is what you bring for the other mothers, and not just the mothers, I would say the parents in our community. So I think focusing on data, focusing on balance, using different kinds of tools to help people through this, and certainly never taking the perspective that everything is normal. It really isn't. We are in a tinderbox of emotion, a tinderbox of frustration. We're working from our homes, and we have been in this situation for some of us for 5 months, for some of us even longer. Acknowledge what people are going through and help them through it, as opposed to trying to maintain the same perspective and the same expectations through the crisis. I'm sorry, Sally, I can't hear you. Yeah.
Still muted. Thank you for that. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you some more about actually coping in this strange environment. But before I do that, I'm conscious that you've mentioned being mindful of things. I did it myself, and then I fell into my own trap. And one of our audience members has written in, and I put my hand up to having fallen into a trap. And the attendee says, when we say women and other minorities, the message we are sending to women of color is that when we speak of women, they are not included. So Obviously, that's absolutely not my intention, but thank you for pointing it out. There is always room for improvement in how we think and how we speak. And so thank you. And I shall try to be mindful of that as we go on. But Pallavi, I want to return to you and to, you touched on how this obviously has been an extraordinary time. So what advice would you give to women in the profession on how to be successful now in the remote environment?
Sally, I'm going to pivot a little bit because you have an attendee who asked you that question. You know, I'm going to really answer that not just for women, but also to specifically talk to women of color. So I think as a woman of color, there's been a number of studies and a lot of data, especially from the American Bar Association. A recent study came out saying about how women of color, we are more likely to leave the profession. 70% of women of color leave the profession as they get more senior, and the numbers get worse for us as we go through the system. It's not new data. You know, I've been in the profession for a long time. We've had this kind of data for a long time. And I think one of the things that I'm seeing change around in finding success is the role of the in-house community. So to the extent that this is, you know, because we have so many in-house participants here, I think you must really talk to the fact that our success as women of color in the profession, they really have a big role to play in that. And that success is really showing itself in a number of our practices. And that is really important for them to acknowledge their own power in making change happen. So I think in terms of strategies with that overrider, I'm going to say one of the things I would suggest is we come to the mindset of coming to succeed every day. We're going to have to strategize differently on how we succeed, right? How do we do business development in this world of COVID? So, you know, some of the tactics I've used is virtual walks. You know, you go on a virtual walk, but also to be authentic in your engagement. So one of the things that I have been doing a lot of is talking to other women of color leaders, other women of color clients, and really talking about how do we engage with the C-suite? How do we show up in a way that we're not physically present? You know, one of the things that women of color face a lot is how do you get seen without being there? How do you get this, how do you cope with this implicit invisibility that comes when you're not physically present? So how do you do that, right? And really having those conversations with other women in leadership and other women who are your peers, and because it is really specific in some ways in how you deal with it. I think the second thing I would say is we need to be authentic. You know, in this work from home environment, we've had to learn to deal with our homes and families in full view of all the glories and imperfections of what it comes with. While this is challenging, it's also an opportunity for us to be authentic in our communications, engage on a personal level. And I do think that's going to be part of the deeper relationships we have with our colleagues and our clients as we move forward. And I think
I'm afraid I have to stop you there. Every one of our panelists could probably talk for the entire webinar, and I'm so sorry to have to interrupt you there. Really important messages I can hear coming through loud and clear about authenticity, about using your own power, I love that phrase, and about working with your own peer network. I'm going to ask if you would switch off your mic and camera so that I can bring in Linda Myers. And Linda Myers from Kirkland and Ellis, welcome Linda, who I'm going to actually, we heard from Pallavi very much about women taking responsibility for themselves. I'm going to take a slightly different tack with you, and I'm going to ask you about what concrete steps employers can take to mitigate the potential adverse effects on women who are working from home and juggling childcare responsibilities and so on. And I know when I address this question to you that you've had very senior leadership roles within the firm and have your own family. So what's your take on that, Linda?
Thank you, Sally. It's great to be here. I think a few things, and these kind of go to the point that Tricia made a moment ago about unpacking some of these neutral policies that aren't really neutral. First and foremost, we're 5 months into the pandemic. Our leadership needs to give women the tech equipment and the tech support that they need to work seamlessly at home. We've just learned in the United States, 62% of our kids are not going back to school in a month, which means this issue is going to get more acute. Second thing, most law firms compensate on the basis of hours, and we look at, for bonus purposes, how many hours someone's worked. I think we need to look at those compensation grids, probably adjust them for some combat pay, as women have been working at home for the last 5 months, and in fact, doing all the childcare, doing the homeschooling, that's going to increase. So take a look at that. Second of all, when you are interviewing lawyers on the front end of the review, as leadership, get behind their stories. Find out what they're juggling, what's happening in their home environment. Get personal in a way that maybe you haven't had to in the past. It's just not about what matters they've worked on and what hours they've put in, but what have they had to deal with as they've been doing that. And adjust ratings and expectations on the basis of those individual stories. Third of all, Flex time. Give some flex time for people to deal with some of these additional things they're having to deal with. Maybe their childcare can't come to the home because that person or those people have been dealing with elder care or sickness or whatever. Maybe the daycare is not open. Clearly the schools in a lot of cases won't be. So please look at flex time as a way of helping people cope with that and giving them the personal time they need. And then I guess the final thing I would say is we need high EQ people more than ever. So if you're a firm leadership person who is populating committees, picking a project leader, thinking about a way to sort of anoint somebody in a leadership role, right now is the time for transformational leadership. And with everything that's going on in the world, grab some of these talented women who might have otherwise not been on your radar and really redouble your efforts to make sure you're including them.
Sorry, still on mute. There we are. Back again. Thank you so much. Those three clear calls to action. I loved your notion of combat pay for women who've been battling in the trenches there. But actually, it's a good point now for me to bring in an audience question that I had, where an audience member said that I presume it's a she. Yes, it is a she. I supervise a team of lawyers. I'm a mum myself, but noticing the problem of the women in the team just not able to work the hours that the men have been able to work. How are you fair to everybody? And you were the one talking about compensation and perhaps even rewarding women extra, but in the cold reality perhaps of some women just not being able to do the billable hours, how do you square that circle?
I don't think it's that different than what we do with parental leave, frankly. I mean, women will actually, in many cases, physically have the baby, right? They're out, physically, and we're able to annualize hours and adjust for that fact. I think the same is true here. We have to recognize that this is falling disproportionately on women to do the homeschooling and the cooking and the cleaning and keep their jobs. And as leaders, if we have those conversations I referenced up front where we're getting that specific story from someone, we can hand tool and make adjustments. Now, I come from a big firm. We've got thousands of lawyers, but I think it's the responsible thing for leaders to do to spend more time on this review process and get behind that, particularly with the pandemic. And then it'll flow helpfully, I think, in the future as more and more women are dealing with these things over time once we're not at shelter at home.
Got you. Thank you very much, and I hope that answer is helpful to our audience member who asked it. I certainly found that very interesting. I will have to say goodbye for now, Linda, while I I'm going to bring in Barbara Becker actually at this point. Barbara, who we haven't seen yet on the panel. So Barbara, if you could join us, please.
Hi.
Hi, Barbara. And what I'm particularly interested in asking you about is about work allocation, actually, because that is something that others have mentioned briefly as well, but I know it's something you've got a particular interest in. And it seems that minorities can be impacted by unconscious bias in the allocation of work. What steps do you think that organizations can take, particularly when people are less visible because they're at home, if they're working from home? What steps can organizations take to eliminate that unconscious bias?
Well, thanks, Sally, and thanks for inviting me to participate. I think, as Linda just said, law firms judge associates and colleagues generally on hours. And that's the billable hour, how much is a person contributing. So there's nothing more important than to make sure that those hours are being fairly distributed amongst all women and persons of color. And so I think the law firms really need to micromanage this by proactively monitoring the associate hours, who is staffed on what deals. And this starts from the day people join the law firm, because the experience that you get as a junior informs how much you're going to be in demand as a mid-level and onward. But also, I think, as others have said, it's important in these times to engage one-on-one with your young mothers and people of color to really get behind that story and understand what people are dealing with, so that you can ask your colleagues to make adjustments and accommodate. I also, think that the firms really do want to retain outstanding, talented women and people of color. So it is a time that people can shine. And so I think if the lawyer is in the practice area or working for a partner who's not particularly engaged, I think that you need to speak up and find opportunities to get engaged. And there are lots of resources to do that, but I would not sit back and wait, because in these times, I think firms will look to trim lawyers over time, and you don't want to be at the bottom of that list. And so I would really take it. I think the firm has a lot to do, but also if you could proactively go out and talk to your network within the firm, people will bend over backwards to try to accommodate if you're one who is volunteering to do work.
Great, so don't just sit there in silence. If the work isn't coming to you, put your hand up, be visible, because we have to face the realities of what's happening to our economies all around the world. So thank you very much, Barbara. I hope to be able to bring you back later, but for now, I'm going to actually bring in Sonia in your place for a moment. So I'm going to say thank you, Barbara, and invite Sonia to the table. Hi, Sonia.
Sally.
Hi,
can you
good to have you with us.
Good.
Hi, Sonia.
Hello,
I'm really interested to know what's your organization actually doing to assist women lawyers during the pandemic?
Yeah, so I'm a partner at Reed Smith, which is another one of the big law firms of the world, and I think this is a time when there's actually some benefit to being at a larger organization that has maybe more, just so many people to support, that maybe they can do a little bit more to help those employees in this time. So at Reed Smith, a couple of years ago, we had launched a global program called Wellness Works, and this is a variety of internal and external resources and support for, at the time, it was originally designed to help with things like stress management, work-life balance, building healthy habits, and things like that. With the pandemic that began a few months ago, we sort of pivoted those offerings to things that are more specifically focused to the issues that we face now. And so through the Wellness Works platform, we've been able to provide a variety of support and services to all of our employees, but some are specifically targeted to women. We've had things such as we've had a speaker series that included things like a psychotherapist speaking about how to manage anxiety, and there was definitely a focus there with questions submitted ahead of time by parents working at home, and the stress and anxiety that comes with that as we try to balance our work obligations with these little people who are in the house and who need help with their remote learning, or just making sure they're logged into their classes, and all these things that that parents, particularly mothers, are focusing on at the moment. And we also launched a mental health program, because I do think a lot of the issues that we're facing in this pandemic are mental. There was a reference, I think, by Pallavi about that we're all living in a tinderbox. You could blow any minute, and I do think that's an issue. We're all coping with, maybe a little depression, a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, and particularly if we have children in the home, how to talk to them about coronavirus, how to keep yourself healthy while you're also keeping your family healthy. These have all been subjects that we've had outside presenters running seminars for Reed Smith lawyers, and I think it's been a great support for everyone. And then lastly, Sally, we've had, my favorite piece of this has been within our women's initiative, we've had what we call Zoom cafes. So these are very informal, and in the beginning we were having them like every 3 days. I think people said, oh my God, I can't Zoom that much, but Zoom cafes, so everyone's invited, but it is mostly women who have showed up for these. Each one has had a facilitator, usually an outside person. For example, we had a series on homeschooling, and so we had a teacher of each of these levels supervising or sort of facilitating a discussion among parents of toddlers, parents of elementary school children, parents of middle school children, and parents of high schoolers, giving very specific tips on how to help you and help your child get through all of this and hopefully get some sleep in the process. I can't tell you so many mothers that I've talked to are, doing their job between, when the kids go to bed at 8 p.m. and when they finally go to bed at, 2:30 in the morning. And, that's not sustainable for the long run. But we are in this crunch situation here, but everyone's in it. And I think part of what I really liked about these Zoom cafes is it's building a camaraderie amongst my colleagues and me, that we all, these things resonate. You hear other people's solutions, you share their, misery loves company, I guess, as the old saying goes. But I think it has brought us closer together while we share resources and share our experiences.
Well, Sonia, thank you. And I'm conscious there in one answer, you managed to deal both with some of the challenges that we're facing, but also some of the solutions that you've put in place there at Reed Smith. I'm going to try an experiment now, actually, to keep you on the line, Sonia, if I can. And if the technology will permit, we'll have to see if the sound quality stays good enough when we do this. But actually, I know that you and Barbara and Linda all wanted to talk about silver linings, wanted to talk about actually good that could come from this pandemic. Of course, we're all aware of the bad. Let me try and invite, thank you, Barbara, and Linda, if you're able, let's see if you can join us. And it's really a question for each of you. Obviously, I can't get you each to speak at once, but it's the same question really for each of you. Linda, let me start with you. What do you see as the silver lining?
Well, first of all, I think a lot of women have been trying to work from home for a long time, right? And I think this forced shelter at home has made that more normal. So I think going forward, there'll be less stigma associated with that. Second thing, women have been juggling for a long time, and we're good at it compared to our male colleagues, I think, in a lot of cases. And so we're doing a lot of that, and that's going to hopefully make it more seamless for us to continue to work. We're not commuting, that's huge. Somebody made a point earlier about networking, and that oftentimes women are left out of good networking opportunities. Well, when you can't be together, you can't network, so we can do more Zoom and so that sort of thing. So I think that's helpful. And then finally, and probably most importantly in my mind, this experience has given male leadership in law firms an opportunity to uniquely see what it's like to try to juggle all this stuff and work at home, either because they're doing it themselves or they're watching their spouse do it. And so I'm hopeful that will give these sort of insight for male leadership to make the kinds of adjustments we've been talking about in other of these questions you've asked.
Well, thank you, Linda. And I saw Barbara particularly break into a smile there as you're talking. So why don't I go, Sonia too, but let me go to Barbara next. Barbara, your silver linings from this.
Yeah, I relate to many of the elements that Linda mentioned. I think the normalization of flexible work and work from home is the big win here. I think that we all can do it, that once we go home, we're not just not working, we're actually working. We just might be working at different hours, and that institutions that were in the mindset that work can only be done at your desk in the office, I think we have a whole new world, and I think that's super helpful. I think Zoom opportunities for women are real. I think that if women's voices are shyer in big group settings, when you're on a Zoom call, I have seen that women are more willing to speak up, and I think that's a real opportunity. I would encourage people to use their videos in these group sessions. I know some people find that awkward, but I would be all in and try to take that opportunity. I also think it's quite easy to ask people to do one-on-one coffee Zooms, and just to introduce yourself, to say you want to work with that person, to whatever it is, and that could be within the law firm, it can be with clients. I think people are eager for social interaction, and so I think you should definitely take advantage of those opportunities. And then finally, I think for me, one of the challenges as a mother of 4 has always been the dinner out and the travel. And the fact that that is now off the table is a complete win.
I can see everybody nodding there, absolutely. And so often I have found women always getting at home for bedtime, or first, and turning down dinners, or feeling absolutely torn by it. And you're right, this current situation has eliminated that, although that probably can't last forever, but may as well seize the day and find alternative ways of networking for ourselves. Sonia, what do you have to say?
Thanks, Sally. First, agree with everything Linda and Barbara just said. Absolutely on point with both of you. I think my main takeaway is that this work from home requirement has legitimized work from home forever. we've always had the tools. We've always had the laptops, the phones, the remote connectivity. I mean, I remember, I think we got it at our firm really locked in about 1999 or year 2000. That's how long I've been practicing law. And it was a game changer then. And now it's a game changer in a new way, because it used to be that we used that stuff, or it was mostly devoted to the road warriors, to people who were traveling around the globe, and we knew they were working from hotel rooms, or they would land and work at some international office of Reed Smith, but with their laptop and their US phone or what have you. But now it's the same infrastructure, it's the same tools, but we're using them in our kitchens, in our bedrooms, in the baby's nursery. But we're getting it done. At least, you know, the productivity numbers at Reed Smith, which, trust me, our management is looking at them very closely, have not changed. I mean, we're just as busy as we were before the pandemic. Echoing what Barbara and Linda said, I think for moms in particular, you know, saves us the commute time. Maybe we don't have to style our hair every day. You know, there are a lot of this sort of benefits to just doing it from home, where we can sort of squeeze more into the day because we've eliminated certain tasks that were time drains. I do think, though, ultimately, I would love to go back to the office. I hope we'll be opening our offices soon, but it is going to be optional. And so I think it will become more accepted for people to work from home a couple of days a week for whatever assists with your family schedule, whether it's picking up kids after school or helping an elderly parent or something like that. But I really think this is bringing, this experience has brought work from home into, sort of legitimized it in a new way, that yes, we can work from home, and yes, we can still be productive and fully functioning members of our law firms.
Fantastic positive notes from everybody about how to take advantage of the situation we find ourselves in. In a moment, we're going to go to audience questions, but before that, if I could ask those of you who are currently camera on to switch off, and I'd just like to bring back Trish, please, if I may, because I think, Trish, you've got something really relevant to say here too. Hi, Trish. I particularly wanted to ask you about the advice that you would give to women in the profession about how to be successful in this remote environment. So really building on what we've just been hearing, but your own take on how to be a success when working remotely.
So the most important thing, I believe, is that you have to own your own career. No one will care more about your career ever than you do. And so you have to be the one to do the outreach, do the I want to work on this case requests, do the extra things that make your career the center of what you're doing. Those are, I think, always important, but even more important in this crazy world we're working in right now.
Thank you, Trish. Great and succinct. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. We are now ready to move on to audience questions. And so for that, I will say for the moment, goodbye to Trish, and instead welcome Patrick, because Patrick and Raoul behind the scenes have been keeping an eye on audience questions. And I know we've got plenty. So I'm going to get Patrick to steer for a moment, please, and let me know which questions we should look at first.
Hello, great. Well, what a fantastic discussion. And Trish would have been in a great position, so maybe she can come back. We have a question which I'll just read, actually, which is, I'm on the board, not me personally, but I'm on the board of the Women Lawyers section of a local bar association. Do you have any ideas of resources, supports, etc., that we could provide our members in this time? Obviously, I'm going to make sure that from Trish that we have the left out and left behind, and also the other, my office next, basically the two papers that the ABA have provided, if you'd be kind enough to put them on our hub. But Trish, well, that's, I think, a particularly good moment for you to step in.
So I would encourage you to go to the ABA website and look on the page for the ABA Commission on Women in the Profession. They have been doing work in this area, and they have resources on the website that are multitudinous. So that is where I would start. You should also look in your state and local bar organizations, because there are plenty of places in which those sorts of resources are available. And of course, get the report that Christina referenced earlier from the incredible work that she did with the Law Society
Great. Actually, to be honest, Sally, I think you've handled most of the questions as you've gone along in a very deft way. So there was a third question for Paul, I think, which we did skip over due to time. So perhaps you might want to jump into that one.
Well, there was, but actually just before that, I've had in another question that's been forwarded to me that actually I think is really relevant and does pick up on something that one of our panelists mentioned, but I'm just trying to rack my brains and remember who it was who touched on this, but I might invite, I'll explain the question, and then I'd invite whichever ones of our panelists feel that that's a question that they would like to field to jump back on to answer it, because I thought it was a really interesting point. Obviously, we've talked a lot about motherhood, but that's not the only pressure that women lawyers have on their time. One of our audience members has said that consideration should also be given regarding the effect on single women with no children, but who do have full responsibility for their homes and responsibilities such as looking after elderly parents. Now, I do know that this mention has been made of elderly parents and the fact that it is also well documented that very often it is women who take on the burden of looking after elderly parents, and sometimes not even just their own, but also their spouse's elderly parents if they have a spouse. So I would invite a couple of panelists, if there are people who have words of wisdom in answer to that question for how we can help women in that situation and not just make it all about motherhood, then please do join me for that. Christina, hi.
Hi, yeah, this is a really important point from our research, that flexible and agile working shouldn't just be a mummy track thing. It's got to be available and open to everyone, and indeed for whatever reason and none. Actually, so whatever it is, whatever way you want to work, the point is about choice, and that's really, I think, where the successful businesses in the future will be able to offer their staff genuine choice about where they work and how they work. And that may, that will be enabling for mothers and other carers, but it will also be enabling for people who like to play tennis. So I think it's something that we should really focus on getting right at this point. So we need to start making demands of our organizations that they are doing the strategic thinking around this, so that as we come out of this crisis, we can embed everything that has been good. I know there's been a lot of terrible things, but everything that's been good about the change, the dramatic shifting of the dial in terms of our working practices.
Indeed, absolutely, indeed, and thank you, Christina, for handling that so well. And indeed, it makes me want to bring in Paul. Anyway, Patrick had suggested bringing in Paul, but actually I have double reason now to bring in Paul. Paul, if you're able to come back on, because we were talking about how the possibilities of agile working, the silver linings of COVID, how they may enable us to recognize that you are your whole self, you should bring your whole self to work, and your whole self has a life. And there are things, whether that's playing tennis or looking after elderly relatives or some other hobby or other demands on your time, it may usher in an era of firms being a little bit more human. But I know that you have expressed some concern that potentially there is a danger that firms might pull back on their diversity and inclusion initiatives when they come under pressure and they're trying to recover from the crisis. So whilst many of us can see opportunities and silver linings, there are risks as well, aren't there? I wondered, Paul, if you'd like to address that.
Yes, with pleasure. And I think the silver linings are great, and I was compelled by that. But I think the thing that you have to remember is that as long as people don't make the correlation between inclusion and diversity and performance, what will happen is, in a system that's systemically unequal and in a crisis, people revert to type. So the fact is that because they consider diverse talent to be other than, less than, I'm not going to make that investment. And the reality is, for a lot of practitioners, we will tell you that the D&I function is siloed off into the HR space somewhere. And until it's elevated to the point that it becomes the key business driver, it is an easy cut to make when you're trying to rebalance the balance sheet.
Indeed. Go on, continue.
No, I was only going to say, sorry, I was watching noting. I was only going to say the classic example of this is I was interviewing a client recently, and we were talking about the diversity of their talent slate, and the extraordinary statement came back to me was this, with a straight face. Well, he said, we want to hire the best talent first, and then when we've done that, we'll look for some diverse talent. And you said, well, I simply don't know where to begin. perhaps you're not the client for me, but it's this mindset that we simply don't understand it. Until we make that link, I think I think the whole initiative, frankly, Sally, is at risk.
And that really speaks to diversity just being an icing on the cake sort of thing, or a little bit of window dressing and so on, rather than being really a core part of the approach of the firm, which is again, it's not just a matter of corporate social responsibility, it's actually in the interests of the results of the firm, isn't it? Thank you very much, Paul, for coming back to answer that question. Patrick, I see, is signaling to us.
Two more questions, one of which I'm going to have to try and decipher, but the first one is going to be quite interesting because we had, it's about boundaries, and the question is, I'm hearing that there's the expectation that people can be on call all the time, and that is really exhausting. So obviously perhaps others would share some experience on that. But one, we did a panel call yesterday, and Serena Wallace-Turner from Radian actually shared some thoughts on this, and Sally, you may well be able to pitch in on this as well. But she said that she makes sure that she has, I think, at least 2 hours where it's time where she sets everything off, and this is a policy within the firm as well, where this is the kind of boundary time when concentrated work or concentrated other activity can be done. Perhaps, Sally, you might be able to remember what you had to say a little bit better than me, but I thought that was a good point on the boundary side.
Yes, it really was a compelling point about having that discipline to mark in your diary some time, say a 2-hour break, where you could get done your personal stuff, because everybody has personal stuff to do. Particularly if you've got children at home or others at home who need your attention, it also means that they can know when they can approach you. Obviously, it doesn't work with very young children, but it works with the ones who are old enough to understand. And it means you don't have to feel guilty about trying to get things done that are actually essential for your life to be sustainable, and you can be clear about it, and you don't need to be ashamed of it. And I think that was the nub of what she was saying. But I wondered if at this juncture, and I think this is probably the last question that we can take, but I wondered if on your boundaries point we might bring in both Kate and Pallavi, because I imagine you will have interesting things to say there about setting boundaries, priorities, managing your time.
Sure.
Kate, why don't you?
Sure, I'm happy to lead off. I actually think this is a really important question, and Sally, I think your point about we all have personal responsibilities. This is another great opportunity, quite frankly, for clients and their outside counsel to collaborate. I think oftentimes people are so worried about I have to answer immediately and so on, and I think that there's a pact that we can have between clients and outside counsel where we can have really honest conversations. What is your deadline? Is it okay if I get to this on Monday rather than Friday afternoon, which was typically how we used to talk about that. So I just think having those conversations, again, being authentic, we're all human, we're all in this boat together. This isn't just our colleagues that we're seeing the kids run in and the cats and the dogs and whatever else might be happening. This is also between clients and their counsel, and that could be for in-house counsel, their internal clients. So I think we just need to all be a bit more honest about it. And I know that a number of folks were talking about authenticity, and Pallavi, in fact, was maybe this is an opportunity to really exercise that authenticity and make it work for everybody.
So thank you, Kate. And this question's clearly struck a chord. So in a moment, we're going to go to Pallavi, and then also Sonia is going to come in on this question as well after Pallavi, because people clearly have views which they're willing to share. So Pallavi first, thank you.
So, two things. I really agree with what Kate said. And, the other thing is don't underestimate the need for in-house counsel to have boundaries as well. So where we think we're being hyper responsive and in-house counsel is sitting there saying, don't email me on Sunday, don't bother me with work on Saturday. A lot of in-house counsel are very focused on their own boundaries. I think secondly, you need to be very cognizant of being able to set time aside for yourself. For me, it's I walk away from the desk at 6 o'clock. I come back online later at night, but you have to walk away. I think there's a physicality of the commute, which is missing from our lives, which used to be the boundary for me when I, sat in my car and listened to Bollywood music on the way home and just, really had a minute to just disconnect. There's no disconnection. You wake up, you wear your clothes and you roll into work, and then you never roll out of work, right? So I think that physicality of a disconnect is important, however you define it. And I would say thirdly, really being thoughtful about the colleagues you work with. I think really being in the space where I send emails late into the night because that's when I work a lot because my son is asleep. But I also tell people who work with me, do not respond to them. Do not look at them because they're not meant to evoke a response. That's how I'm finding balance in my life. Doesn't mean that that requires action on yours, but that conversation is really important to set those boundaries.
Thank you. Absolutely. And that thing about being considerate to others and letting them know that you're not expecting a response, you're just managing your time. Sonia.
Thanks, Sally. Absolutely echo what Pallavi just said. The line between work life and home life, it's non-existent right now unless you create it for yourself. And I think that's so important. And then echoing what Kate said, we need to get clear with our clients on what their expectations are, because I will tell you, in the beginning of June, I was listening to a Zoom panel of some general counsel based in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they all have extremely high expectations for our responsiveness right now. One of them said flat out, I know you can get on a call at any time because you guys aren't getting on planes anymore. So we don't have that excuse anymore. Oh, it's a travel day. I'll call you when I get to New York or what have you. That's gone. And so they expect us to be on point at all times. And another of the GCs on this panel said, we're not working from home. We're working remotely in a pandemic. And so to me, those were very kind of insensitive comments about the challenges that we face working from home, because we are working from home. We've got kids and pets and dirty dishes and beds that need to be made and all of this stuff, and it's in our faces all day long, every day. And it's really difficult as we try to juggle this. So my two recommendations, similar to what the other panelists have said, try to get clear with your clients on when they're going to be at work. Sometimes it's very challenging because you're in a different time zone than they are, but it's good if we all just know typically when we're online and when we're expecting each other to be responsive. And the other thing, I rely very heavily on my own internal team at Reed Smith, and I'll let them know. Even today, I let them know. I'm on a webinar for 2 hours, so you guys have to answer any client questions that come in while I'm gone. We have some big motions we're filing tomorrow, and I expect that the client might be pinging us. And but hopefully you all also have those colleagues that you can rely on to fill in those gaps when you're baking the birthday cake or driving your mom to a doctor's appointment or whatever it is, all these many demands on our time as we try to juggle all of these various and sundry responsibilities.
Well, thank you. And on the subject,
just one small point to make on that, and then I think we'll invite everybody to be on the screen to actually say goodbye. But I think actually one of the things that Serena's solution, and I know Serena's not on this particular panel, but what I like about it is the fact that it's actually talking about wisdom. Because you guys, I'm not a lawyer, but you're hired for your wisdom, and your wisdom comes from what Daniel Kleinman would talk about as being second type of thinking, where you're actually thinking deeply and also able to draw on that 30-year experience or 20-year experience. And that doesn't happen if you're always having to answer every question every moment. So I think that's a really important thing to take away, is that you're hired for wisdom. You need to give your mind space to be able to provide that. Great. Okay, Sally.
Well, thank you. I just really remains for me to say thank you. I'm mindful of time management, which we've been talking about, and so we now need to bring this to a close. I hope it's been interesting. I hope we've answered some of your questions. I really want to say thank you to Patrick for hosting, and also to all of our fantastic panelists for all of your many and varied and interesting contributions.
Thank you all very much indeed. Raoul also, who has been doing all the technical work in the background, something you've not seen, but we're both up at about 1:30, but we're very happy that we've managed to do it, and there he is. So thank you all very, very much indeed. I hope this has been as meaningful for the people who've been listening as it has been for us to put this together. It hopefully won't be the last one we do as well. Hopefully we'll get to some of these deeper, topics deeper as well. And good night. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.